Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Susan Wright. The case of Susan Wright in the early 2000s shocked everyone with its cruelty, but the perpetrator received deserved punishment. Years later, this story wasn't clear-cut, and a bloody conclusion was preceded by patience, resignation, and silence. This seemingly ideal family hid dark secrets behind closed doors. Let's understand the case of the blue-eyed butcher to comprehend what pushed a fragile young mother to a monstrous act. Susan Lucille Wright, née Weddle, was born on April 24, 1976, in Houston, Texas, to Velma Sue and Jimmy Lawrence Weddle, a simple family. She was the elder of two children, raised with her biological sister Cindy. From a young age, Susan was an active and sociable child with creative talents. During her school years, she was deeply engaged in dancing and aspired to become a choreographer in the future. The girl had a bright, attractive appearance and a slender figure, with numerous admirers, and she enjoyed being the center of attention. After finishing high school, Susan was unable to get into college. Nevertheless, she did not give up and decided to take a break to save money for her education. For months, she worked as a dancer in a famous club in the city, where she performed topless, which left her unsatisfied. She then left that job and used her savings to pay for night classes at a nursing school. Alongside her studies, she worked as a waitress to support herself, but realized that nursing was not her true calling, needing to abandon the courses and focus on the job. In the summer of 1997, 21-year-old Susan met her future husband, Jeffrey Andrew Wright. Their first encounter was at the Galveston restaurant where she worked as a waitress, and he stopped by for a meal. He was instantly captivated by the beauty and radiant smile of the blue-eyed blonde, leaving generous tips and becoming a regular customer from then on. Jeffrey took a while to ask her out, but eventually mustered the courage to get her phone number. Susan later recalled that Jeffrey began calling her daily, sometimes several times a day, arranging romantic dates and small surprises like sending flowers with touching notes to her workplace. In the evenings, he would meet her and walk her home. Jeffrey was 8 years her senior, but this minor age difference did not particularly bother them. He was attentive, very sweet, and caring, quickly winning over Susan. Around this time, they acquired their own home in the peaceful Harris County, Texas, moving in just a couple of weeks before the birth of their child. The ideal family. In December 1998, the Wrights welcomed their first child together, a son named Bradley. In 2001, Susan became pregnant again, and in the spring of 2002, she gave birth to a daughter, Kay. The couple also got a small dog named Buck, had their own comfortable family car, and seemingly lived a life that exemplified the American dream. Jeffrey worked at a local construction company, and after the birth of their children, Susan, by mutual agreement, became a homemaker. She took care of raising the kids and creating a comfortable environment in their home. Neighbors with whom Mrs. Wright maintained friendly relations spoke of her as a kind, friendly, and sociable young woman, a caring mother, and a loving wife. The family indeed seemed perfect, but as it turned out, the reality was quite different. Her husband was extremely controlling in all areas of her life. Susan's daily routine revolved around cleaning, laundry, and cooking. Jeffrey insisted on freshly home-cooked meals and refused to eat leftovers or meals prepared in advance. The house had to be meticulously clean and organized, which was challenging with two young children. Jeffrey also demanded that his clothes be washed almost daily, as he would not wear the same item twice. Failure to comply with these strict rules often resulted in insults, humiliation, and even physical abuse. Financially, Jeffrey was extremely stingy. The romantic partner who once gifted flowers and presents had disappeared, and he now only gave his wife $100 a week. This was meant to cover cooking, maintaining the house, and buying everything necessary for the children. Susan had to account for all expenses to her husband and provide receipts. Jeffrey did not quit drinking as he had promised earlier, and that was just the beginning of the issues. He began using drugs again, categorically denying his addiction and referring to his drug use as light doping to cope with work stress and stay in good shape. However, under the influence of these substances, he often became aggressive, capable of hitting his wife or even their young son. Whenever Susan pleaded with him to seek professional help and undergo rehabilitation to overcome his destructive habits, Jeffrey reacted with outbursts of anger, arguing that Susan married him knowing about his alcohol and drug use, and thus she should now accept and live with it. Remarkably, Jeffrey's parents were also aware of their son's weaknesses, but they sympathized with their daughter-in-law, feeling helpless to assist her. The last straw, according to the woman, was that her husband began displaying aggression towards her almost immediately after they started living together. This manifested in physical, emotional, and intimate abuse. Initially, he would apologize each time, promising it would never happen again, and she wanted to believe him, but soon Jeffrey stopped apologizing, and the violence in the family became a commonplace occurrence. Jeffrey visited the gym 3 times a week to practice boxing, saying these workouts allowed him to blow off steam, adding that he would definitely take his son with him once the boy was a bit older. On Monday, January 13, 2003, Wright went to the gym after work, as he usually did. When he returned home, he seemed excited and nervous. While his wife was preparing dinner, he decided to tell his son about boxing and demonstrate a few techniques. At one point, he misjudged his strength and accidentally hit the 5-year-old boy. The child burst into tears, and the father tried to calm him, hoping his wife wouldn't hear. Susan, indeed, pretended not to notice, but this incident was the final straw for her. After dinner, she went to put the children to bed while her husband remained in the bedroom, where he consumed more controlled substances. Susan claimed that when she entered the room, her husband attacked her, sexually assaulted her, and tried to kill her with a knife, but she was able to disarm him, and the ensuing confrontation was in self-defense. However, her story changed several times, and the investigation's theory presented at the trial seemed more credible, becoming the official account. Seduced, restrained, and violently ended a life, Susan decided to use her dancing skills to seduce her husband and lower his defenses. She entered the room wearing a short silk robe over her bare body, performing a tantalizing show for her husband. Then, she proposed a role-playing game involving tying him up, to which he readily agreed. She used 3 of Jeff's neckties to bind his hands and right leg to the bed, and his left leg was secured with the silk belt from her robe. Once he was immobilized, Susan improvised a gag using her own underwear, adding to the guise of an intimate game. To set the mood, she lit candles and turned off the lights. Jeffrey was bound hand and foot, securely fastened to the bed with a gag in his mouth, surrounded by dim lighting. Initially, Mrs. Wright took one of the candles and poured hot wax on the man's chest. Although painful, it still resembled a part of their game. Then the same fate befell his intimate area, and soon the pain became unbearable. Jeffrey did not immediately realize what was happening. He tried to free himself, tried to scream, but to no avail. Meanwhile, his wife repeatedly struck him with a small, sharp knife she had brought from the kitchen. She started with the groin area, moving up and down, slashing his genitals, legs, abdomen, chest, arms, neck, and face. At first, Susan acted slowly, voicing her grievances with each strike, recounting the insults, humiliations, and abuse she had endured. Then she began to cry and struck faster and faster. Forensic experts would later count 193 shallow knife wounds on the Jeffrey. The majority of these wounds were not fatal, and Jeffrey was conscious for most of the ordeal. Her actions indicated she was in a state of despair and intense emotional turmoil. With her lawyers insisting on a state of effect, she couldn't stop even when her husband showed no signs of life, and she hadn't yet considered what she would do next or how she would handle the body. Susan cautiously peered out the window, ensuring no neighbors had their lights on and that it was quiet and deserted outside. Her gaze fell upon a shallow pit that Jeffrey had dug over the weekend to install a fountain in the backyard. A plan formed instantly. This pit was to become the grave for her despised spouse. To move the body from the bedroom to the yard, Susan used a common garden wheelbarrow. This action raised many questions for the investigators, as a petite, slender woman was able to single-handedly load and transport a man who was much taller and twice her weight out of the house. There were suspicions of an accomplice, but these speculations were never confirmed. Under the cover of night, Susan moved her husband's body into the pit and buried it, though lightly covered would be more accurate. She then shouted, removed the blood-stained curtains and bed linen, placing them in several trash bags and dispersing them in different bins. The bloodied mattress was simply flipped over to the other side, as she didn't know what else to do with it. The remaining time until dawn was spent scrubbing blood from the floor, walls, and carpet. The carpet presented a problem, as a large stain proved impossible to remove. Resourcefully, the lady soaked it in bleach, hoping the chemicals would destroy any traces of the violent confrontation that had occurred in that room. Later that morning, Susan called her husband's parents, who lived in Austin, Texas, sobbing. She informed them that her husband, while under the influence of alcohol and controlled substances, had physically assaulted her and their young son. He then caused significant damage in the house, spilling a bottle of bleach on the carpet before declaring that he was fed up and leaving her. Jeffy's parents were shocked. They were aware that their son was not perfect, and they genuinely felt sorry for their daughter-in-law. But upon hearing that he had hit the child, they immediately offered for Susan and the children to come and stay with them for a while. However, Susan refused. She added that she would file a report with the police and disclose everything that had been occurring in their home. 2 days later, Susan went to the police station as her husband's sudden disappearance was raising more and more questions, and something had to be done. She reported that she and her children were victims of domestic violence at the hands of her husband and needed protection. Susan managed to obtain a restraining order against her husband from approaching her and the children, although she already knew very well that her significant other would never be able to come near them again. Susan showed bruises and cuts on her arms, which she claimed were inflicted by her husband with keys when she tried to fend him off. There was also a small bruise on Bradley's face, and the boy confirmed that his dad had hit him. At first glance, the story told by the tearful woman sounded quite plausible and logical. Her husband, under the influence of a mix of alcohol and controlled substances, had attacked his wife and young son, and then, realizing what he had done, got scared and fled. However, as time passed, Jeffrey made no contact, which became very suspicious. It appeared he had run away without his belongings, documents, and even his mobile phone was left at home. The man hadn't shown up for work or at his parents', and none of his friends or neighbors had seen him. It was as if he had vanished into the air. Such behavior is typical of criminals who decide to go into hiding, but in this case, the individual had not ended a life or inflicted serious injuries to justify such a drastic action. The disturbing truth was that Susan found it unbearable to remain in the house where she had confronted her husband and where his body was buried in the yard. She began to feel as if he were still alive and about to rise from his grave for revenge, and their dog, Buck, kept barking and attempting to dig up the burial site. On January 17th, Susan went to her mother's house. Her mother was aware of what had happened, but upon seeing her daughter, she realized the full extent of the truth. Velma simply asked, "You killed your husband, didn't you?" Her daughter burst into tears and nodded. She confessed what had happened and revealed where she had hidden the body, repeatedly saying she didn't know what to do next. On her mother's advice, the next day, Susan contacted a lawyer named Neil Davis, to whom she confessed to ending her husband's life and trying to conceal her crime. The experienced defense attorney learned all the details, considered the possible scenarios, and on January 19th, called the office of the Harris County District Attorney. Davis reported that Susan had ended her husband's life and buried his body in the backyard, as she herself had confessed, and was ready to give a statement at the police station. On January 24, 2003, Susan voluntarily went to the police, stating that she would make a full confession. Her story was disjointed, and she got confused in the details, sometimes contradicting herself. She spoke of her late husband as if he were still alive, claimed she was afraid of him, and asked for protection. Consequently, she was subjected to a psychiatric evaluation, which revealed a nervous breakdown and depression, but overall, Wright was capable of understanding her actions. When the body of the deceased husband was exhumed from the makeshift grave in the backyard, investigators were shocked, having never encountered such brutality before. Experts counted 193 knife wounds on the victim's body, with 8 in the groin area, around 30 on the legs, 23 on the shoulders and arms, 22 in the abdominal region, 46 on the chest, 23 on the neck, and 41 on the face. Only one head wound could have been the cause of death, while all other cuts were superficial and individually did not pose a direct threat to life, suggesting that the man endured a prolonged and agonizing death while conscious as his wife repeatedly struck him with a small knife. Deep marks were found on Jeffrey's wrists and ankles from the ties and belt used by his wife to bind him. The nature of these injuries indicated that the victim had tried to free himself, but was unsuccessful. Notably, the ties and belt remained on the body. Traces of candle wax were also found on the deceased's chest and groin area, and Susan claimed it was accidental, as her husband had knocked over a lit candle onto himself, but the prosecution believed that the hot wax was more likely a form of torture inflicted on the bound victim, meant to cause suffering. In the mouth of the deceased, his wife's underwear was still present, acting as a gag that prevented him from screaming or calling for help. Toxicological reports revealed traces of alcohol and several controlled substances in Wright's body. Under the influence of such a cocktail, he could have indeed behaved aggressively and irrationally. The bedroom where the confrontation took place seemed normal at first glance, except for a large bleach stain on the carpet that Susan had spent a lot of time cleaning. However, once chemical agents and specialized equipment were used to reveal traces of erased blood, the scene presented itself in a completely different way. Blood was found everywhere, even on the ceiling, and the mattress was completely soaked in it. The trial of the accused began at the end of February 2004. By that time, Susan had been in custody for a year, and her children were being cared for by her parents and sister Cindy. Her lawyer was well prepared for the trial and had worked extensively with his client. Susan was almost continuously in tears as she recounted that horrific night and the events leading up to it. According to Susan, she had suffered years of abuse and cruel treatment from her husband. But when he started raising his hand to the children, she couldn't bear it. The defendant claimed that on the fateful evening, her husband returned from training in an agitated state, began demonstrating boxing techniques to their 5-year-old son, and said the boy would also take up boxing. When a frightened Bradley refused, his father hit him in the face. Susan then put the children to bed and decided to have a serious talk with her husband, urging him to seek help at a clinic. However, he became angry, grabbed his keys, and was about to leave. She tried to stop him, leading to a struggle during which she sustained injuries to her palms and wrists. Then, as the defendant claimed, her husband struck her, causing her to fall and momentarily lose her bearings. When she regained her senses, she saw Jeffrey holding a knife. Susan's testimony became highly inconsistent thereafter, and she couldn't explain how the weapon ended up in her hands. Her lawyer attributed this to a state of affect, arguing that it was why his client, having seized the knife, began to strike and didn't stop until she had inflicted multiple wounds all over her husband's body. Regarding the ties and belt, Susan claimed she attached them to the victim's limbs after the confrontation to secure him to the cart and transport him to the yard. The wax, as previously mentioned, supposedly landed on his body accidentally from a candle on her bedside table that she lit in the evenings instead of a nightlight. However, she couldn't explain at all why her underwear was found in the deceased's mouth. The prosecution's version and arguments were far more convincing and logical. Experts proved that the deep wounds and abrasions on the wrists and ankles were inflicted while Jeffrey was still alive, suggesting that the binding was part of an intimate game used by the defendant to lure the victim into a trap. Consequently, the presence of a gag in Jeffrey's mouth was also reasonably explained. Furthermore, all injuries were inflicted at a certain angle, as if the perpetrator was above Jeffrey's body, sitting astride him, not in the midst of a struggle, which would have resulted in a different pattern of injuries. All the cuts were made from the front, as the victim was lying on his back and securely fixed. Whether Susan had premeditated her husband's demise and planned to use the pit he dug for the fountain as a grave was not definitively established. However, the prosecution leaned towards the theory that she had carefully planned everything, hoping to receive a substantial sum from insurance. The case drew widespread public attention, with Susan dubbed in the media as the blue-eyed butcher or blonde meat grinder. Jeffrey's family demanded harsh punishment, while neighbors saw bruises on Susan's body that she blamed on clumsiness, evoking pity. The prosecution initially sought life imprisonment, later reducing it to 45 years, and in 2004, Susan was sentenced to 25 years, showing no reaction. A year later, Susan's lawyers attempted to file an appeal, but it was rejected. In 2008, Susan and her defense team filed another appeal, and this time, a new witness's testimony significantly influenced the course of the case. The witness was a woman named Misty McKell, the wife of former NFL champion Steve McKell. In the mid-1990s, Susan had a long-term relationship with Jeffrey Wright, to the point of becoming engaged for about a year. She spoke about experiencing physical abuse, humiliation, and cruel treatment from Wright, which led her to end the engagement and permanently cut ties with him. Given these new circumstances and the witness testimony, Susan's prison sentence was reduced to 20 years in 2014. At the age of 38, she became eligible for parole for the first time, but her request was ultimately denied. She received a second denial in July 2017. Finally, in the winter of 2020, after spending 16 years in prison, the woman was released. She was 44 years old at the time of her release. Waiting for her outside the prison walls were reporters and photographers, at the sight of whom she burst into tears and pleaded to be left alone. It's worth noting that Susan's trial received extensive media coverage and was even broadcast on the national American television network, Court TV. Sadistic serial killer Michael Madison. 2 weeks shy of Halloween 1977, Michael Madison was born on October 15th in Cleveland, Ohio. His parents, Diane Madison and John Baldwin, accidentally got pregnant and didn't have much of a relationship at the time of his birth. John Baldwin left Diane to care for their young son and denied being Michael's father. Growing up, Diane's mother had been a sex worker and heroin addict. She grew up in a household full of neglect. Diane's upbringing left her unprepared to care for her young son independently. Shortly after giving birth to her son, Michael, social workers were brought into the home. Diane was allowing her constant stream of boyfriends to punish Michael. When Michael was 2, Diane was found to have forcefully stuffed food down Michael's throat. As a result, the toddler began vomiting uncontrollably. Unsure of what to do, Diane put her screaming son into a tub full of hot water. This caused Michael to cry more. Growing frustrated with her young son, Diane took him out of a bath and beat him with an extension cord. A year later, one of Diane's many boyfriends beat Michael so severely with a belt that the young boy vomited and needed to be hospitalized. In another horrific incident, Michael was beaten so severely by another one of Diane's boyfriends that he lost hearing in one of his ears. After years of abuse, Michael was sent to live with his grandmother, who was still a heroin addict and sex worker. But unfortunately, Michael's horrific childhood wouldn't change. Michael continued to be hospitalized for reasons such as dehydration. The social workers involved in Michael's case would note that he and his half-brother were covered in scratches and bruises. Before Michael reached high school, he had become a familiar face to law enforcement. On several occasions, the teenager had been found using women. In high school, he received a delinquent charge for inappropriately touching another classmate. The crimes Michael committed as a teenager were nothing like the ones he would go on to commit as an adult. In July 2013, the family of 38-year-old Angela Deskins reported her missing after they hadn't heard from her since June. Deskins was known for disappearing from time to time, so the family didn't think much of it. A month after she went missing, her body was discovered wrapped in electrical cords with a belt around her neck. 28-year-old Shadisha Sheely was reported missing in September 2012 when she didn't show up at her mother's house. Sheely, along with her 12-year-old daughter, were living with extended family at the time, and Sheely was supposed to stop by her mother's house to borrow some money, but she never showed. Her body was found in July 2013 inside a plastic garbage bag. After returning home from her job at an elementary school, 18-year-old Sherelda Terry disappeared. Her body was also found inside a black trash bag. On July 19, 2013, Michael's neighbors called the police to report a horrible smell coming from a garage near his second-floor apartment building. Inside the garage, the police discovered the decomposing body of a woman. During the police search of the surrounding area, including other vacant homes and backyards, the police found the bodies of 2 more women. Each was wrapped in plastic bags and located approximately 200 yards apart. The police were granted a search warrant for Michael's home, and inside they found further evidence of decomposition. Now the search was on to find where Michael Madison was. The police tracked him down to his mother's house. When they arrived, Michael refused to come out, resulting in a several-hour-long standoff between him and the police before he finally agreed to come out and was taken into police custody. Michael never once showed remorse to the victims' families during the trial. Michael laughed, smiled, and taunted the families. During Sherelda Terry father's victim impact statement, Michael smiled at the distraught father. This set Terry's father off, and he tried to attack Michael but was quickly stopped. Michael didn't stop smiling once during the altercation. The jury deliberated less than a day before Michael Madison was found guilty of all 3 murders. He was also found guilty of 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of gross abuse of a corpse, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of weapons possession by an ex-convict. On May 20, 2016, Michael was sentenced to death, a sentence he would attempt to appeal a month later. On July 21, 2020, the Ohio Supreme Court voted unanimously to uphold the death sentence for Michael Madison. Killer Ronald O'Brien. Children are cautioned from an early age not to accept candy from strangers. While this golden rule is strictly enforced by vigilant parents throughout the year, on Halloween night, they throw caution to the wind and allow their little ones to go door to door asking for treats. In most instances, their request is granted without worry. Even so, once in a while, the monsters that lurk in the shadows take advantage of the occasion, resulting in dire consequences for the most innocent among us. In 1974, a boy in Pasadena, Texas fell victim to just such a predator when he became violently ill after indulging in a treat from his Halloween bag. After the concerned parent, his father had stayed by his side during the hour-long ordeal, offering comfort to the youngster as he convulsed on the bathroom floor. Only 8 years old at the time, Timothy O'Brien died later that night on his way to the hospital. In a shocking turn of events, an autopsy revealed that he had ingested enough potassium cyanide to kill 2 grown men. As difficult as it was to believe, all signs pointed to the fact that someone had deliberately laced candy with the colorless compound before randomly handing it out to unsuspecting children. Investigators were convinced that a cold-blooded killer was hiding somewhere in the suburbs of Houston, and they intended to find him. With no suspects in mind and little evidence to go on, detectives theorized that an unscrupulous person who was angry at the world in general had decided to take the life of a complete stranger, a child no less, as a way of getting back at society. To make a difficult situation even worse, there was no telling how many children had received the tainted sweets. Although authorities had put out an emergency news bulletin requesting that all Halloween candy be brought to the police station for inspection, they feared that there would be other victims before all was said and done. While they faced an uphill battle, to be sure, investigators did have a few things working in their favor. For one, it had been raining heavily on the evening of Trick or Treat, which had limited the number of houses that Timothy and his sister Elizabeth had visited. More importantly, a chemical analysis of the contents of the boy's treat bag had enabled them to pinpoint the carrier of the poison. Lab tests revealed that the killer's lethal weapon of choice had been the sweet and sour powder contained inside of a straw-shaped pixie sticks. After meeting with the residents of the houses where the O'Brien children were known to have gotten candy, detectives were confident that none of them had given up pixie sticks. However, during the course of their interviews, they learned that someone had been witnessed doling out that particular treat and that someone had been Timothy's father, Ronald O'Brien. When he was brought in for questioning, O'Brien claimed that a man he had never seen before had emerged from a darkened home and given him several pixie sticks to hand out on his behalf. He added that, after consuming a small amount of the sugary powder, Timothy had complained that it tasted funny. Instead of telling him to throw it out, he had given his son a soft drink to help wash it down. Under the pretense of helping police solve the case, he had readily provided them with the address of the house where the exchange had taken place. Upon speaking with the mystery man, who turned out to be an air traffic controller named Claudine Melvin, officers learned that he had an alibi for the night in question. According to him, he had been at work and had not returned home until well after midnight. When they visited his place of employment, his supervisor confirmed his story and had the paperwork to prove it. In a stunning show of support, 200 of Melvin's coworkers came forward to vouch for his character. Realizing that they had been duped, investigators quickly concluded that this man was not their killer, something that Ronald O'Brien had known all along. A bit of digging into his past uncovered that Ronald O'Brien, who had trained as an optician, was not nearly as respectable as he wanted others to believe. I'm not content who couldn't hold a job, he was drowning in a sea of debt. Not above taking what he wanted, he had been accused of stealing on numerous occasions, usually by former employers. While being shiftless and prone to theft doesn't necessarily mean that someone is capable of murder, the fact that O'Brien had taken out hefty life insurance policies, not one but three, on his children in the months prior to his son's untimely death moved him to the top of the list of suspects. Another nail in O'Brien's self-constructed coffin came when it was discovered that he had phoned the insurance company on the morning after his son's death, inquiring about a payout. As the 8-year-old's body lay in the icy morgue, his father's only concern had been how quickly the money he had coming would change hands. On November 5, 1974, less than a week after Timothy was poisoned, Ronald O'Brien was taken into custody and formally charged with 1 count of murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. To no one's surprise, he pleaded not guilty across the board. He would steadfastly maintain his innocence throughout the trial, despite the damning evidence against him. During the proceedings, a parade of witnesses testified that O'Brien had become fixated on the properties of cyanide in the months leading up to his son's murder. His obsession led him to brazenly ask friends and family alike if they knew where he could purchase the deadly poison. He would also inquire of them if they had any idea how much of the substance it would take to kill a person. In June of 1975, 8 months after little Timothy O'Brien had been laid to rest, his father was convicted of his murder. He was also found guilty in the attempted poisonings of the other 4 children, none of whom had ingested the lethal powder. For his crimes, Ronald O'Brien, whom the press had dubbed the Candyman, was condemned to the electric chair. Down the road, as alternative methods of execution were introduced, his punishment was amended to a more humane death by lethal injection. It had taken the jury just over an hour to decide the fate of the man who had so callously plotted and carried out the murder of someone who had trusted him implicitly. Once the verdict was in, the waiting game began. As it happened, 9 years would pass, more time than Timothy had spent on this earth before his killer would face final justice. During his time on death row, O'Brien was reviled by his fellow inmates who, despite their own misdeeds, considered him to be lower than a snake's belly. Their hatred of the child killer ran so deep that they had thrown a party on the day of his demise to let him know that he would not be missed. After several stays of execution, O'Brien was put to death on March 31, 1984, at the age of 39. When asked if he had any last words, he had taken the opportunity to rail against the system that had allowed him to come to such an end. When his death was announced over the loudspeaker, hundreds of people who had gathered outside the prison to celebrate the occasion had shouted trick or treat while throwing handfuls of candy in the air in remembrance of Timothy, a young boy who had paid the ultimate price for his father's greed. Todd Allen Reed, the Forest Park killer. The bodies of 3 women were found in the same stretch of parkland, all within a month of each other. It was not long before police had their man. But is he responsible for more than the 3 murders they convicted him for? 32-year-old Todd Allen Reed was already a registered sex offender when he strangled to death at least 3 women before dunking their naked bodies in Forest Park, a heavily wooded area just west of Portland, Oregon. From 1992 to 1995, he had served a measly 2.5 years of a 12-year sentence for the sexual assault of Shelley Harding, who was 7 months pregnant at the time of his cowardly attack. She had been walking home from work when he approached her and forced her into his car at knife point. Reed was involved in and fled the scene of a minor crash with another vehicle on his way to the secluded spot where he sexually assaulted Shelley. After he had assaulted her, he attempted to strangle her with a seatbelt and began to cry. Shelley was strong and she was calm. She had been talking to Reed constantly, like he was a friend almost, building a rapport. Whilst doing so, she made sure to leave as much physical evidence as she could, touching every surface to leave as many of her prints as possible. Whatever this monster was going to do to her, she wasn't going to make it easy for him to get away with. When Reed broke down, she used this to her advantage, and her pleas to be let go and her promises that she would not tell anyone worked. Reed let her go. Not only did Shelley report her abduction and assault, the 2 men that had been in the car that Reed had crashed into also reported the hit and run. They even had his license plate. Reed pleaded no contest and was handed the 12-year sentence. He was registered as a sex offender and, crucially, his DNA was taken and stored in the state crime lab. This would be the golden ticket police needed to catch the Forest Park serial killer 7 years later. Reed was released early as he had built up sentence-reducing credits, half of which were for good behavior. At roughly 8 miles long and 5,100 acres, Forest Park is one of the largest urban forest reserves in the USA, ranked 19th to be more precise. It is not easy to wander from the 70 miles of trails due to the park's dense vegetation. To highlight just how secluded this park can get once you're off trail, in 2004, a 53-year-old man called Frank and his 12-year-old daughter Ruth were discovered to be living off-grid in the park. They had been there for 4 years, completely undetected. On May 7, 1999, a couple walking their dog on one of the park's more remote trails would come across the body of 28-year-old Willa Faye Mahler. She was naked and face down, entangled in thick blackberry brambles. She had been strangled, and it was determined that her body had been there for around 2 months. Police would find a used condom merely 28 feet from her body. They were able to extract DNA from this vital piece of evidence. The next day, May 8th, police themselves would discover a second body whilst they were searching the immediate area. The body of 26-year-old Stephanie Lynn Muscle was found around a quarter of a mile away from where Lilla had been discovered. She too was found naked and had been strangled. Tests would determine she had been left there less than a week before she was found. They would also recover traces of DNA on her thighs. A group of hikers would find the third body, that of 18-year-old Alexandria Eisen, in the early evening of June 2nd. Alexandria had been reported missing sometime in May. Police were unable to reach her body until the next day. Due to the location, she'd been dumped down an extremely steep slope, just off of a deer path. She was found naked, and she too had been strangled. Her body was around 1/4 of a mile away from Lilla and Stephanie's. After the discovery of Alexandria's body, Police Chief Charles Moves admitted that investigators had concluded they were looking for a serial killer due to the similarities of the crimes. Physically, all 3 women resembled each other, but they also had very similar life experiences. They were all homeless at the time of their deaths and had cocaine and heroin addictions, although Stephanie had just completed a detox program before her murder. Lilla and Alexandria had been at some point engaged in prostitution to pay for these addictions. All 3 women were known to frequent West Burnside Street. It's also been claimed that Lilla and Stephanie knew each other, although this has not been proven either way. It was determined that all 3 of the women had been murdered elsewhere and their bodies were taken to Forest Park afterwards. Toxicology all showed that they had taken heroin sometime before their deaths. The police response was immediate and it was impressive. A specialist task force consisting of 16 individuals was formed, and they set about scouting bars, reaching out and offering protection to the community being targeted, and 30 additional beds were made available for homeless women during the investigation. Although residents were not happy about the lack of information they were receiving, the police kept their investigation tightly under wraps. Such was their determination to catch this killer. The task force would use the physical similarities of the three women to their advantage. A female officer of a similar appearance posed as a prostitute on West Burnside Street to see if they could reel the killer in. And sure enough, Wright took the bait. On the July 7th, the same day a vigil was being held for Lila, Stephanie, and Alexandria, Wright approached the undercover officer, and it was not long before his suspicious behavior flagged him to police. At about 5:20 a.m., he was approached by a member of the lookout team, Sergeant John Botchelet. Wright readily admitted that he was a sex offender and agreed to a search of his vehicle. They found an unused condom, a book entitled A Killing Gift about a woman who can kill men by merely looking at them, and some yellow strapping. There was nothing incriminating to be found, and the police had to let him go. He was not off the hook, however, far from it. Another lookout that night, Detective Sergeant Dave Schlegel, recognized him from the 1992 sexual assault case. He had in fact been the arresting officer. Police began 24-hour surveillance of Wright, both at his home and at his place of work. At least once during this surveillance, he was observed driving in circles around West Burnside and Sandy Boulevard. The police swab results came back and confirmed that the DNA from the condom at the Mower crime scene and the DNA found on Stephanie's thighs matched the DNA that was on file for Todd Allen Wright. At around 7:30 p.m. on July 18th, after Wright had left for work, police executed a search warrant at his address, where he lived with his girlfriend. Once the police had left the premises, his girlfriend phoned him to let him know the police had been there. He attempted to make a getaway in the middle of his shift, but it was too late. The police had already arrived. At 11:30 p.m. on July 18th, 11 days after police had questioned him and only 1.5 months after the task force was set up, Wright was arrested outside of Ranella Produce, the warehouse where he worked night shifts, unloading the delivery trucks. On July 27th, he was indicted on 7 criminal counts in relation to 3 homicides. It emerged that Wright, who had been ordered to serve 8 years post-prison supervision and actually been kicked out of a sex offender treatment program 2 weeks before his arrest for failure to attend. On February 23, 2001, he pleaded guilty and received 3 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Wright had been facing the death penalty, but his plea deal took this off of the table. Wright is also the prime suspect in 2, possibly 3, other murders in the Portland area. The cases being referred to by Wright are the 1987 cold case murders of 15-year-old Jennifer Lyncher and 12-year-old Mindy Colleen Thomas, and the 1999 disappearance of 19-year-old Amma Vecines. In regards to the murders, Gresham Police Sergeant David Lerwick has been quoted as saying, "Always suspect that he was the person who killed both those girls. We didn't have enough evidence to convict him." Jennifer had gone missing on July 3, 1987, and her skeletal remains was found on July 8, 1988. Mingy went missing from the apartment complex where she lived on August 3, 1987, and her body was discovered on October 4, 1988. Both of the children had been strangled and dumped in wooded areas on the eastern side of Gresham, about 3 miles apart, and they were both last seen in the company of Gail Bennett, Wright's then girlfriend and later wife. They married in 1988 and divorced in 1997. Gresham police said Bennett, who has a police record of her own, might have information about the killings but has been uncooperative. Bennett has denied any knowledge. At the time, police were operating under the assumption that they had both been killed by the same man, and that this man was known to them. They had questioned Wright at the time of the investigation due to the fact they had both been seen with Gail, but he was never charged or arrested. Police renewed efforts to solve the Gresham cases after his arrest in the Portland killings, but attempts to compare DNA from the old crimes with Wright's DNA have been inconclusive. Amma the witnessing on June 30, 1999, and has not been seen since. She was working as a prostitute at the time of her disappearance, and it has been claimed she knew / was friends with Alexandria Eisen. No charges have been brought forward in her case, although it is impossible to downplay the likelihood they already had something to do with Ametha's disappearance. As of June 2020, what prison Wright is in is not known, and as of June 2021, he was no longer listed as an inmate and may be dead. On the morning of February 19, 2020, as the first light began to brighten the street and silence settled throughout the city, a man was thoughtfully cleaning his car. Suddenly, loud screams pierced the quiet. His heart raced as he turned to see a nearby car coming to an abrupt stop. In the front seat sat a visibly pale and frightened woman, screaming hysterically, while the man beside her remained calm and composed. The man approached the car. Tension filled the air, ready to explode. Then, a deafening bang echoed through the morning, followed by a flash of light, like lightning tearing through silence. Thick smoke and fire obscured the sky. After what felt like an eternity, he came to his senses amid chaos. He saw a woman engulfed in flames, screaming in agony. Panicking, he grabbed a hose in a desperate attempt to douse the fire, but it continued to spread relentlessly. What was meant to be an ordinary day transformed into a nightmare where flames and fear dominated. What led them to this horrific scenario? When did normality morph into such tragedy? Hannah Clark was a vivacious 31-year-old woman who brought energy to everyone around her. Yet her fate took a dark turn, resulting in irreversible loss that shattered her life. She courageously faced off against a man whose name was once engraved in her heart, but paid an immense price for this confrontation. This tragic event occurred in Camp Hill, located in eastern Brisbane, Australia, a serene town where once vibrant life vanished abruptly, leaving behind only memories of its past vibrancy. Hannah Clark entered the world on September 8, 1988. By 2020, she was a devoted mother to 3 children, 2 delightful girls and 1 spirited boy. However, her family faced challenging times. When Aaliyah, 6 years old, Liana, 4, and Trey was just 3, Hannah left an indelible impression of her warmth and cheerful disposition in the hearts of those who loved her. Her entire family remembers her as an exceptionally gentle and kind spirit with a radiant smile that could brighten any room. She dedicated herself entirely to her children, giving them everything they needed. Together with her ex-husband, Rowan Baxter, a rugby player from the New Zealand Warriors, they raised their children. Despite a significant age gap between them, their relationship quickly grew deep and strong. Yet Sue Clark, Hannah's mother, never fully trusted Rowan. Hannah chose to ignore her mother's reservations about him. People around Rowan often spoke poorly of him. He had trouble remembering even his 4-digit bank card PIN and neglected to register his car after purchasing it, claiming no one had informed him about the necessity of such formalities. Hannah's parents were burdened with despair. Confronted with this difficult situation, they realized that interfering in Hannah's relationship with Rowan might lead to them losing their bond with her altogether. Their hearts were heavy, but they decided not to fight against it to preserve their cherished connection, the love and trust of their daughter. Sue had concerns about Rowan from the beginning. She sensed something amiss about him. He appeared arrogant and self-centered. The considerable age difference troubled her as well. When they met, Hannah had just graduated, while Rowan was already an adult at 31 years old. The fact that he hadn't finalized his divorce when they first began dating added to their worries. When presented with this situation upon meeting Rowan for the first time, Hannah's parents inquired about his ex-wife's circumstances. Rowan explained he still lived with her due to obligations towards his son. Eventually, though, Rowan finalized his divorce and continued pursuing a relationship with Hannah despite initial concerns from those closest to her. In 2011, he proposed to her, and Hannah yes. A year later, they married in Kingsley, New South Wales, Australia. They had 3 children together. The eldest daughter, Aaliyah, was quick-witted and inherited the best qualities from her mother, according to her grandmother's stories. Liana, the middle daughter, was a charming child who aspired to be the center of attention and always pleased those around her. The youngest child was Trey, perhaps the most beloved. Hannah adored him. He also showed athletic talent, which brought great joy to his parents who were involved in sports. Rowan was a former professional athlete who loved working out at the gym. He had impressive muscles, though their origin was not related to hard work, but to steroids use. This led to a mental disorder for him. Like Hannah, Rowan worked as a personal trainer, though their methods differed greatly. Clients loved Hannah for her kindness and caring nature. Because of this, she had many regular customers. Rowan's approach as a trainer was fundamentally different. His inappropriate and aggressive behavior, caused by steroids, made him unsuitable as a trainer. For example, he would call clients fat and clumsy on social media and often insult women during training sessions. Rowan faced difficulties in communicating with people, which affected his career and financial situation significantly. Hannah had to take on the role of breadwinner in the family. This only irritated Rowan even more because he felt humiliated that his wife was doing a better job than he was. Despite financial difficulties, they decided to open their own fitness club together. In between training sessions, they both worked part-time at a sports store, a decision made by Rowan so he could control Hannah's every move and know her whereabouts always. Their story is marked by contrast. While one shone through kindness and empathy, the other struggled with aggression and challenges in communication. However, his conduct in the store mirrored his behavior in the gyms where he previously worked. It seemed that Baxter consistently sought to display his superiority over women. During a personal training session with Sue, Hannah's mother, Rowan revealed a more malicious side. Instead of demonstrating the expected respect for the club owner and his mother-in-law, he acted inappropriately. During the session, Rowan deliberately caused Sue to fall. She struck her head on the floor and began to bleed. In such circumstances, any reasonable person would have apologized and promptly assisted her. But Rowan was different. He not only showed no empathy, but also laughed cynically at Sue and made sarcastic remarks about her clumsiness throughout the remainder of the training. Despite this incident and their own reservations, Hannah's parents endeavored to accept Rowan for their daughter's sake. Personal training sessions with Baxter became torturous for clients. Insults like fat and lazy were frequently directed at them. At home, his tyranny extended to Hannah and their children. Over time, his insults grew more cutting. He punished Hannah for any misbehavior, anything that displeased him. He forbade the children from seeing Sue, their grandmother, and prohibited Hannah from communicating with her brother. Hannah found herself isolated and severed from family and friends. Rowan exercised absolute control over her life, including taking away her clients and dictating who she could see and when. Gradually, she became akin to a prisoner within her own home. Each day, Rowan demanded intimacy from Hannah. Any refusal provoked his anger, which he then directed at her and the children. After coercing her into compliance, he would smile insincerely and offer a false apology, attributing it to an outburst of passion. In isolation and under constant control and cruelty, Hannah's spirit began to diminish. Rowan's tyranny was affecting both her life and those of her children adversely. The marriage that once thrived on love had devolved into a living nightmare for them all. Hannah lived under immense fear, imprisoned by unseen but potent bonds. Rowan, a tyrant and a brute, sought her obedience through threats and violence. His words pierced her heart like venomous thorns. "If you don't obey, I will hurt you." The specter of his wrath haunted the house, tainting each day. Hannah's environment was a cage of prohibitions put up by her husband. Wearing short shorts or bright colors, symbols of freedom and self-expression, was strictly forbidden to her. Rowan could not bear for his wife, whom he considered his property, to attract attention. He believed her place was in the shadows, away from prying eyes. Hannah did not dare to defy him. Any attempt at self-expression aroused his fury and rage. The insults and bullying extended beyond just Hannah. Rowan often directed undue harshness towards the children. While playful games among parents and children are common, Rowan frequently crossed all boundaries, inflicting intentional harm on them. When they cried out in pain, he mocked them, showing no regard for their feelings. Once, a playful fight with Aaliyah escalated into tragedy. Rowan miscalculated his strength and deliberately pushed the girl. She hit her head severely. The injury was deep enough to require hospitalization and stitches. Instead of consoling his daughter and apologizing for his aggression, Rowan blamed Aaliyah. This wasn't the only form of torment he inflicted on his children. As an athlete accustomed to ice baths post-training, a standard regimen for adults, Rowan forced even little Trey to endure the icy water despite their pleas and tears. He even posted photos and videos of them on social media with captions like, "Even my kids take ice baths." Remarkably perceptive despite their youth, the children understood their predicament well. Aaliyah, the eldest daughter known for her quick wit and resilience, often argued with Rowan and tried to resist his tyranny. Whenever she overheard her parents arguing, she intervened in an effort to shield her mother from Rowan's ire. Feeling suffocated by Rowan's oppressive control, like a stranglehold on her soul, Hannah recognized that the toxic atmosphere was harming not just herself, but also the children profoundly. She decided to take a critical step, confronting her husband head-on despite knowing his cruel tendencies well. She understood that he might use the children against her in his ruthless mannerisms. Hannah did not believe he was capable of physically harming them. However, the fear of being denied the chance to see them tormented her greatly. She was a dedicated mother, willing to do anything for her children, yet she felt trapped. A single misstep could result in losing the most precious thing, the bond with her beloved children. In that same year, Hannah experienced a life-altering event. Rowan developed an interest in jiu-jitsu. One day, after returning from training fueled by adrenaline, he unexpectedly attacked Hannah. His hands tightened around her throat, and chilling words escaped his mouth. Overwhelmed by fear, Hannah did not immediately recognize herself as a victim of domestic violence. This assault was far more terrifying than anything she had previously endured. In the aftermath, Hannah resolved to leave Rowan Baxter at the earliest opportunity. When she contacted the police, she detailed the horrors she had endured. The responding officer informed her that coerced intimacy without consent constitutes domestic violence. This conversation was pivotal for Hannah. It opened her eyes and motivated her to take immediate action. She took her children and sought refuge at her parents' home, determined to escape the nightmare that shadowed them. By early November 2019, their relationship had not yet legally concluded in divorce. During this period, Hannah decided to allow Rowan some time with their children, despite having little control over the situation without court intervention. Nonetheless, she understood that trusting Rowan with the children was precarious at best. Rowan struggled with his emotions and perhaps sought solace by consulting Pastor Christopher Ans from his church. Christopher, known for his kindness and willingness to listen, provided Rowan with support and counsel during this challenging time. Over time, Christopher began to observe unsettling characteristics in Rowan. He noticed Rowan's desire for dominance and control. In moments of vulnerability, Rowan confided in Christopher, admitting his awareness of the illegality of his actions and his need for assistance. However, he had no idea how to remedy the situation. This confession marked the initial step towards reformation. Christopher's support and wise advice could have been beneficial on this challenging path, but it did not transpire. One day, Hannah and her children were walking quietly down the street when, without warning, a terrible event occurred. Rowan suddenly appeared, seized Liana, their middle daughter, and disappeared. Hannah's world fell apart. Intense anxiety and fear for her daughter's safety overwhelmed her. For 2 days, she was unable to locate Liana and had no knowledge of her whereabouts. The growing anxiety became unbearable torture. Eventually, Hannah sought assistance from the police. The officers conducted a thorough search and fortunately located Liana with her father. The girl was found alive and unharmed, although the experience left an indelible mark on her psyche. Recognizing the imminent danger to Hannah and her children, the police strongly recommended she file a formal report against him and obtain a protection order. However, Hannah, paralyzed by grief and fear, was not able to take this crucial step. Despite the numerous issues caused by Rowan, he was unfortunately still awarded joint custody of the children. This legal leverage enabled him to persist in his abuse of Hannah. Following another visitation with their father, the children were returned to Hannah's parents. Before departing, Rowan attempted to humiliate Hannah by displaying photographs of her in her underwear near his car where their children could see them. Overcome with anger, Hannah tried to retrieve these photos, but Rowan responded violently. He grabbed her shoulder, twisted her arm, and struck her in the face, resulting in a split lip. It remains unknown how severe this assault might have become if Sue, Hannah's mother, had not intervened promptly to assist her daughter. In response to intervention and shouting insults, Baxter drove away hastily. Hannah, gripped by shock and despair, went to the police because this attack clearly violated her protection order. Sadly, the authorities didn't act swiftly, which resulted in a heartbreaking tragedy. The day started out as usual and seemed like it would just be another working day. But there was an underlying sense of destiny. On February 19, 2020, clutching her car keys with hopes of a peaceful morning, Hannah left her parents' house to take her 3 children to school and kindergarten. Yet fate had other intentions. Minute by minute, moment by moment, disaster loomed over Hannah and her children's lives. Like a magnet drawing them inescapably into darkness, they were pulled towards it. When Hannah got into the car with her children, Baxter unexpectedly climbed in as well. Fear gripped Hannah for herself and her children. She pleaded with Rowan to leave them alone, but his unchecked rage filled the air with threats and demands for Hannah to start driving. Not wanting to escalate the situation, she obeyed. As Hannah turned onto Raven Street, she noticed a man cleaning his car nearby. In what seemed an ordinary moment, fate took a sudden turn towards catastrophe. Desperate for vengeance, Rowan grabbed a canister of gasoline from under the seat and doused Hannah and her children with it. Michael Zach was an accidental witness to this scene. He later recounted hearing the sound of a car pulling up to his house that morning. Panicked, Hannah screamed for help at him. She begged that Rowan wanted to kill her and had covered them all in gasoline. Rowan, holding tightly to Hannah, didn't let her go for a moment. His desperate cries for help got lost in a storm of silent madness. Michael approached the car from the passenger side and encountered a harrowing sight. Rowan's blank expression and the lighter he held. In an instant, flames engulfed the vehicle, a burst so intense it chilled the blood. Screams echoed, ears ringing, and then there was silence. The explosion left Michael stunned, disoriented, and pulled him out of reality itself. When he regained awareness, he was initially unsure of his surroundings or what had transpired. All around him lay chaos. The acrid smell of burnt metal and gasoline filled the air. Flames ravaged the car, reducing it to charred remains. Amazingly, Hannah managed to escape the blaze, scorched and bloody but alive. She screamed frantically, "My children! Where are my children?" Pleas for help poured out, not for herself, but for her children, still in danger within the burning inferno. As if answering her desperate cries, a passing car stopped. A doctor, off duty but compelled by conscience, rushed towards her. Upon reaching Hannah, he heard her anguished cry, "My children, they're there. Why didn't I stay with them?" That single phrase captured all her world's pain and despair. She was torn apart by regret and self-recrimination for surviving when her children did not. With professional composure and urgency, the doctor endeavored to assist amid the turmoil surrounding them both. Michael didn't hesitate for a second. Grabbing the hose at his house, he began pouring water over the burning car. The fire was ruthless, though. It consumed the entire vehicle with no hope of saving the children. Both the doctor and Michael started shouting for Hannah to duck and hide to put out the fire, but in her grief, she didn't hear them. "My children! Where are my children?" she cried out, her words filled with desperation and madness. In those first terrible moments after the explosion, Michael didn't notice the children inside. It was hard for him to believe Hannah would put them in such danger. Only later, when her screams finally made sense to him, did his heart fill with chilling horror. He raced toward the car to rescue them, but the flames were too fierce, the heat unbearable. All efforts were futile. Hannah lay on the road, her body scorched by fire, repeatedly saying, "My children, someone save my children." No one yet grasped the tragedy's full scale. Burns covered more than 97% of her body. Only her feet remained untouched, the only unaffected place on her severely burned body. Despite unimaginable pain, Hannah couldn't stop thinking about her unprotected children. Indeed, those who had always said Hannah was selfless were proven right. The police looked at her burned body and knew survival chances were slim. Yet, Hannah did not accept that fate easily. A courageous fire in her heart allowed her to summon every last bit of strength to give a testimony to police officers, a final gesture before facing an awful death. Officer Angus Kay wrote down every word she managed to say. Through pain and despair, she tried describing events that led up to her tragedy. Hannah, struggling to move her lips, identified her ex-husband, Rowan Baxter, as the individual responsible and relayed all the details. Her voice grew softer by the minute, and her frail body weakened further. Officer Key stayed by her side throughout. He commended her for her bravery and reassured her that she had already contributed significantly and everything would be all right. His actions would later receive high praise from the authorities. His professionalism was crucial in gathering materials that became key to a verdict. Even in her final moments, Hannah didn't fully grasp the horror unfolding around her. When questioned about previous threats from Rowan, she denied any such instances. Doctors came to alleviate her pain, but she could no longer speak. Amidst all this chaos, Rowan Baxter behaved oddly. Despite burns covering 80% of his body, he exited the car on his own. While Hannah pleaded for her children's safety, he sat on the road, staring at the burning vehicle. After some time, Rowan, seemingly possessed, climbed back into the car engulfed in flames. One of the bystanders, risking his own life, attempted to extinguish the fire at the rear of the vehicle. At that moment, Rowan retrieved a knife from inside the car and drove people away from it, preventing them from extinguishing the blaze. The children, trapped in a dire situation of steel and flames, had virtually no chance of survival. Nonetheless, onlookers did not cease their efforts to rescue them. Rowan's actions kept everyone at bay, effectively sentencing his children to a painful demise. What drove him? Was it a desperate attempt to shield them from an inevitable fate or an act of madness clouded by selfishness? One witness made an effort to reason with Rowan, pleading for him to drop the knife and allow a chance for the children's rescue. However, Rowan was unresponsive. As the children perished and Hannah succumbed before his eyes, Baxter turned the knife on himself. His selfish act eradicated any remaining hope for everyone involved. The children died. Hannah followed shortly thereafter, and Rowan's motives remained shrouded in mystery. At this tragic scene, a senior doctor noted Hannah's valor. Observing her wounds, which were clearly fatal, he saw only her concern for the children's welfare and a desire to convey the truth in her eyes. Hannah Clark passed away at the hospital on the very same day of her admission. Only 31 years old, she was a tragic of severe domestic violence, along with her children. Despite facing immense danger, Hannah tirelessly fought to protect her family from an abusive individual. Her courageous efforts, although ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated her steadfast resolve. Each day, she exhibited remarkable bravery, putting her loved one's safety above all else. Through her relentless effort to confront her harrowing circumstances, she ensured that her story would endure. On March 9, 2020, Hannah was laid to rest alongside her children. This event deeply affected the Clark family. In their grief, they decided to establish the Small Steps for Hannah Foundation with the mission of ending domestic violence in Australia. Just 4 days after this heart-wrenching event, thousands gathered to bid farewell to Hannah and her children. Hannah's memory will live on in Camp Hill through Hannah's House, where new trees were planted and a plaque installed recounting her life story. Through these initiatives and remembrances, Hannah's legacy persists for future generations to honor and remember. In December 2020, Hannah Clark was recognized as the Woman of the Year by Marie Claire. This honor celebrated her courage in battling domestic violence. Yet her story continues beyond this recognition. Although Baxter is no longer alive, police have not closed the case. Their aim now is to delve into his motives to prevent similar tragic events from happening again. Those who knew Rowan describe him as egocentric and violent. Nicole, a friend of Hannah's, expressed her strong frustration. She spoke to the police, criticizing their inaction and negligence. Why wasn't help given to Hannah? Why were the children not saved? These questions remain unanswered for now, but one thing is evident. Rowan Baxter's selfishness led to a devastating tragedy. It left behind only grief and unresolved questions that will haunt many. Hannah's mother shared harrowing details of what her daughter suffered due to Baxter's influence. She recalled an incident at the gym where Rowan intentionally dropped Hannah on the floor, highlighting his aggressive nature further. A pastor who conversed with Baxter also noted his controlling tendencies and lack of empathy toward others. Pain. On January 26, 2020, investigators discovered a note left by Baxter just before the tragic incident. In this note, Baxter expressed that he considered himself a victim. He wrote, "I can't take this anymore. She must understand how hard it is to not have to see my own children. My life is ruined." Notably, Baxter signed the note on his own behalf and seemingly on behalf of the children. This detail underscores his perception of himself as a victim and his accusation against Hannah for ruining his life. The content of this note made Baxter's intentions evident. It appears he may have had plans to kidnap the children and retaliate against Hannah. During the court hearing, it was revealed that a week before the tragedy, on February 13, 2020, Hannah had alerted her friends about potential danger from Baxter. Her friend, Nicole Brooks, contacted the police on her behalf to warn them that Hannah and her children were at risk. Regrettably, the police did not take these concerns seriously, stating there was no specific threat they could act upon. Despite Nicole's persistent efforts, her warnings went unheeded. This situation exemplifies how inadequate laws to protect women from domestic violence can result in tragedy. Had stricter regulations been in place, perhaps the authorities could have responded more swiftly and effectively, potentially preventing the loss of Hannah and her children's lives.